Black Flag has always been in a slightly strange position within Assassin's Creed. It is regularly described as one of the best games in the series, but when people explain why they love it, they normally start talking about sailing through the Caribbean, listening to sea shanties, or attacking another ship because it happened to appear on the horizon. You know, all the parts where you are not really being an assassin. And Black Flag Resynced seems completely aware of that. It expands the pirate side of the game, updates the combat and stealth, adds new content, and fixes several of the problems people had with the original. A lot of the early coverage has even treated Resynced as the definitive version of Black Flag. The version that keeps what people loved, removes some of the frustration, and makes the whole experience easier to return to today. And that is really why I decided to take a closer look at it. Because when a remake is being described as the new definitive version of a game this popular, I want to know what that actually means. What has genuinely been improved? What has simply been changed? And has Resynced created a better version of Black Flag, or just a version that focuses more heavily on the parts people already remembered most fondly? Because for most of the game, the changes work really well, but the more I looked at what Resynced adds, removes, and restructures, the less convinced I became that it completely replaces the original. And that is a little surprising, because on the surface, this should be the easiest remake in the world to recommend. Black Flag was already great, Resynced just had to make it feel better to play today. The original Black Flag came out in 2013, but the basic idea behind it has aged surprisingly well. You have a ship, you have a large part of the Caribbean to explore, and almost everything you do feeds back into becoming a more capable pirate. You attack ships to collect resources, and those resources improve the jackdaw, which lets you attack larger ships, explore more dangerous waters, and eventually take on the legendary vessels spread across the map. It's a very simple loop, but it works because the rewards are directly connected to the fantasy of the game is trying to sell. You're not collecting 50 pieces of wood because a menu says you are now 3% closer to completing an area. You need that wood because the ship in front of you has more cannons than you do, and you would prefer not to sink within the first 30 seconds. The open world also has a really good habit of distracting you. You might start by sailing towards a story mission, notice a damaged Spanish ship, decide that it looks like easy resources, and suddenly spend the next 20 minutes in a naval battle you had no intention of starting. Then you board the ship, add it to your fleet, and spot an island nearby. At that point, the original mission is basically gone from your mind. Black Flag gives you a lot to do, but most of it feels connected to the same central experience. Sailing, exploration, and progression support each other instead of feeling like separate systems placed across the map. And I think that is part of the reason it still feels refreshing now. Modern open world games are often much larger, but they are not always better at giving you a reason to care about the space between objectives. Black Flag's map is technically huge, but a lot of the space is open water. The actual islands and cities are fairly compact, which means the games can feel expansive without every location becoming another giant checklist. Resynced keeps that structure almost completely intact, and honestly, that was probably the right decision. The pirate fantasy did not need to be redesigned, it just needed a version that no longer felt like it was being held together by technology from 2 console generations ago. The visual upgrade is obviously the first thing you notice. Resynced has been rebuilt using the latest version of Ubisoft's Anvil engine. The water simulation is completely different, lighting is ray traced, and their environments have been recreated using modern rendering technology. Major cities can now be entered without the loading screens that separated them from the open sea in the original. There's also the new dynamic weather system, more environmental destruction, and 60 frames per second options on the current consoles, and Black Flag is a really good game to give this treatment. The Caribbean was already one of the most colorful settings in the series. Now the water actually reacts to the weather, storms feel violent, and cannon fire can briefly light up an entire ship through the fog. When the sea is calm, it can almost look too inviting. When a wave appears that is roughly the size of a small apartment building, and suddenly the holiday feeling disappears. But what matters is that the new technology does not only make the game prettier, it also makes the world feel more connected. You can sail towards Havana, leave the jackdaw, and enter the city without the obvious transition that used to divide those experiences. You can dive underwater in far more places, reach coastal areas from the sea, and explore locations that previously felt more separated than the main world. Those are good remake changes. They do not completely reinvent the game, but they make the original ideas feel more complete. The problem is that the environments are still largely built on the same foundations. Havana looked dramatically better, but it's still a relatively small city designed around the movement of a game from 2013. The new visual detail can occasionally make those older spaces feel even smaller because the presentation suggests a level of scale that the actual layout does not always provide. So Resynced can look like a completely modern open world, while still still moving and behaving like an older one underneath. That's not necessarily bad. In some ways, the smaller locations are part of what makes the game easy to enjoy, but it is the first example of a problem that appears throughout the remake. Resynced has modernized how Black Flag looks. It has not always modernized what Black Flag was built to support. Naval combat was the original game's defining feature, and Resynced has mostly avoided making unnecessary changes to it. You still weaken an enemy ship with cannons, close the distance and board it for the larger reward. It is straightforward, but the different weapons give you enough to manage during a fight. Broadside cannons deal the obvious damage. Mortars lets you pressure the ships at a distance, and the swivel guns help target weak points once the enemy has been exposed. The remake expands the system without turning it into something completely different. The Jackdaw now has heated shot and shrapnel barrels, while the reworked fleet system lets you send captured ships on missions to generate money, trade goods, and rare activities. Unlike the original, Kenway's fleet is fully integrated into the game instead of relying on an external companion service. You can also recruit 3 new officers. Each officer has a separate quest line and eventually provides a benefit to the Jackdaw. That gives the crew a little more personality and makes upgrading the ship feel less like you're only buying numbers from a menu. The new navigation tools are useful as well. You can place a destination and follow a visible route yourself, or hand the navigation over to an autopilot system. That might sound like the game is encouraging you not to play it, but it works surprisingly well when you just want to listen to the crew sing and look around. And yes, the original shanties return along with 10 new ones. That is important information. We are trying to determine whether this is the definitive edition after all. What I like about the naval editions is that they understand the original system was already strong. They offer more options and make traveling less awkward, but the fundamental rhythm is still there. Find a ship, decide whether the resources are worth the fight, and realize halfway through that it was a man of war and you have made a serious mistake. That part of Black Flag remains excellent. The original's on-foot gameplay has aged much less gracefully. Edward could move quickly, but the older parkour system had a habit of interpreting suggestions as direct orders. You would try to run through a doorway and Edward would decide the wall beside it looked more interesting. You would chase a target across a rooftop and suddenly jump onto a chair that nobody involved had noticed. Resynced makes the movement more responsive. Landing animations are shorter, jumping feels more deliberate, and a roll can be used to maintain momentum after dropping from a height. There are also new ziplines in the cities and an optional advanced parkour setting with manual jumping, side ejects, or greater control over how Edward moves. It feels smoother, especially when you're just moving through Havana and climbing around the rigging of the ship, but the old geometry still creates occasional problems. These locations were not designed around the level of control the remake now provides, so the advanced movement can sometimes feel like more system than the environment actually needs. The cities are relatively flat. Most buildings are close together and their obvious route is normally still the best one. You have more control, but not always more interesting places to use it. Stealth has received a larger overhaul. Edward can crouch anywhere, light and shadow now affect visibility, and the observe system lets you mark enemies and locate objectives. Crowd blending, hired dancers, and traditional hiding places also return. Those changes sound substantial and individually they work. Being able to crouch whenever you want is better than waiting for Edward to enter one of the original's designated stalking zones. Approaching a coastal location from underwater also gives you more flexibility, but there is a strange mismatch between the new stealth mechanics and the missions inherited from the original. The original Black Flag became slightly infamous for the number of missions where you had to follow someone while staying inside a marked area. On land, this usually meant walking between groups of civilians while 2 characters delivered exposition. At sea, it sometimes meant attempting to hide a pirate ship behind another pirate ship, which was apparently a perfectly reasonable approach to espionage in the 18th century. Resynced changes how these missions work. Losing sight of a target no longer automatically means failure. If you are discovered, the objective can change. You might have to chase the person, fight the guards, or recover a note or find the information somewhere else. Some tailing objectives have also been replaced with investigations or more traditional stealth sections. This does remove a lot of the frustrations that the players had of the original. It also gives the missions a bit more flexibility, because making a mistake can create a different situation instead of immediately returning you to the last checkpoint. But I do think the remake may have reacted a little too strongly. Several missions that previously depended on social stealth have been changed so heavily that the new crowd systems barely matter. The remake improves Edward's ability to hide among people, then removes many of the situations where doing that would have been useful. It is clear that this pushes the campaign further towards straightforward action without giving Edward the dialogue or disguise options that support the newer RPG entries. The original had too many rigid tailing missions. That doesn't mean the solution had to be reducing so much of the social stealth around them. A better version probably existed somewhere in the middle. Keep the idea of gathering information without being noticed, but allow the player to adapt when the plan goes wrong. Resynced does some of that, it just is not always consistent. The combat is probably the most divisive change in the remake. The original system was incredibly simple. Wait for an attack, counter it, and then chain together a series of executions until everyone nearby had reconsidered their career. It was not difficult, but it was fast and looked good. Resynced replaces that with a more deliberate parry-based system. Enemies have stun meters, timing matters more, and Edward has new attacks involving his pistols and rope darts. There's also a new demolitionist enemy designed to create more pressure during larger fights. On paper, it has more depth. You cannot stand in the middle of 10 guards and wait for them to politely attack one at a time in quite the same way. The issue is that combat now feels heavier and occasionally less precise. Boarding ships happens constantly, so even a small amount of friction becomes noticeable when you're fighting similar groups of guards again and again. The original system understood that these fights were mainly there to maintain the flow. They were short, stylish, and then you moved on. Resynced asks for more attention, but the encounters themselves have not been redesigned enough to consistently justify it. Some reviews have praised the added challenge and more tactical approach. Others prefer the original's faster chain kills, clearer camera work, and ability to move through groups without interrupting the momentum. I can understand both sides. The new combat is probably more engaging when you look at one fight in isolation, but Black Flag is full of fights. After boarding several ships in a row, the original simplicity starts to feel less like a limitation and more like a sensible design choice. This is one of the clearest examples where Resynced changes something without clearly improving it. Resynced adds a surprising amount of new story material. The largest addition is an 8-mission endgame chapter called A World Without Gold, which expands Blackbeard's story. Stede Bonnet also receives a new mission and epilogue, while 3 recruitable officers each have their own smaller questlines. There are additional Blackbeard treasure missions and 4 optional Animus rifts connected to Edward and other major characters. Matt Ryan returned to record new material as Edward, and several members of the original cast also contributed new dialogue. The best additions give more time to characters who left the original story rather quickly. Blackbeard is one of the most memorable people in the game, but the original campaign had to move through his story at a fairly rapid pace. Giving him more space makes sense, and Stede Bonnet's new ending offers some closure that was missing before. The officer missions also makes the Jackdaw feel more like it has an actual crew rather than a larger collection of people whose main responsibility is singing whenever Edward touches the wheel. But not all the additions feel equally necessary. Some of the new dialogue repeats ideas the original story had already communicated. Edward's greed, his unwillingness to return home, and the consequences of his decisions are central to his character, but the remake occasionally explains those themes more directly than it needs to. A few of the new lines also make Edward sound more committed to the assassins earlier than he should be. His story works because he spends a large part of the game misunderstanding the creed and using everyone around him for his own benefit. Making him sound too heroic too soon weakens the development that is supposed to happen later. It is worth noting that on the other hand, some additions deepen Edward, while others make him feel mischaracterized during the part of the story where his selfishness is essential. More story does not automatically create a stronger story. Sometimes it adds context. On the other hand, sometimes it simply says the quiet part out loud. This is where calling the remake the definitive edition becomes more difficult. The original modern-day storyline is gone. Black Flag originally placed the player inside Absterco Entertainment, where you explored an office hijacked computers and gradually discovered how Edward's story connected to the wider Assassin's Creed universe. Those sections were not universally loved. A lot of players probably saw them as interruptions between the parts where they could return to the Jackdaw. The original game had a deliberate connection between Edward's search for the observatory and what Absterco wanted from his memories in the present day. Without that framing, some of those ideas no longer receive the same conclusion. Resynced includes optional Animus material, but it does not fully replace the original storyline. The remake also leaves out the original multiplayer and the Freedom Cry expansion. Freedom Cry follows Adewale and deals directly with slavery in the French Caribbean. It is a separate story, but it's also one of the most substantial pieces of Black Flag content. Not including it makes the word definitive difficult to use. The original mission replay system and the full synchronization objectives have also been removed. Those optional challenges could be annoying, but they gave players a reason to revisit missions and showed how Edward was supposedly meant to have completed them within the Animus. New Game Plus has now been announced, which should improve replayability once it arrives, but it does not bring those specific challenges back. Some players will not miss any of this. They want the historical story, the ship, and the Caribbean. Everything else is something they tolerated to reach those parts. And Resynced is clearly designed with with those players in mind, but a definitive edition should ideally preserve the complete experience while improving the parts that aged poorly. Resynced is not really doing that. It is creating a more focused version based on what people seem to remember most positively. That may make it more enjoyable, it also makes it narrower. Even with the changes, Edward Kenway remains one of the strongest protagonists in the series. He does not begin as an assassin, and for a long time he does not really care about their conflict. He steals the identity of a dead man because he thinks it might make him money. When he learns about the assassins and Templars, his first reaction is not to choose a side. He tries to work out which group might be more useful to him. Edward is charming, but he is also selfish. That is why his story works. The people around him gradually build something in Nassau based on freedom and independence, while Edward keeps treating their relationships as another opportunity to improve his own position. By the time he understands what he's losing, most of it is already gone. Resynced does not fundamentally change that arc. The original performances remain strong and the new scenes provide more time with several important characters, but the remake's more important storytelling occasionally removes some of the restraint that made the original moments land. The ending still works because Edward has finally recognized what his decisions cost him. It does not need to explain every stage of that realization along the way. The original trusted the players to watch him slowly become a different person. Resynced sometimes feels nervous that we might miss the point. For someone who has never played Black Flag, Resynced is probably the easiest version to recommend. It looks significantly better, runs at higher frame rates on current hardware, and removes a lot of the frustration from the older mission design. The naval gameplay is still excellent. The new exploration options improve the open world, and the additional missions give important characters more time. It is also performing extremely well. Resynced sold more than 3 million copies in its first week, earned the strongest aggregated reviews for an Assassin's Creed release since the original Black Flag, and currently holds a very positive rating from Steam users. So when people call it the definitive version, I do understand why. For a new player it probably is. You can buy one game on modern hardware and get a polished version of Edward's main story without dealing with the technical limitations of the original. But for returning players, the answer is more complicated. The new combat is not clearly better. Some of the improved stealth systems do not have enough interesting situation built around them. The modern day story, multiplayer, and freedom cry are absent, while smaller elements like mission replay and full synchronization challenges have also disappeared. And that leaves both versions with something the other one does not have. Resynced is the better modern pirate game. The original may still be the more complete version of Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. That difference matters, because the pirate fantasy is a huge part of why the game became so popular, but it's not the only reason the story worked. Black Flag Resynced is a good remake of a great game. The Caribbean looks incredible. Sailing remains one of the most enjoyable systems Assassin's Creed has ever produced, and the quality of life improvements makes the campaign much easier to revisit. The new missions are generally welcome, and the changes to tailing objectives remove some of the original's most frustrating moments. But Resynced also has a habit of confusing additional complexity with improvement. The combat is more involved, but not always more enjoyable. The stealth system has more tools, but many missions do not make meaningful use of them. And while the remake adds new stories, it also removes enough existing content that calling it the complete edition feels slightly misleading. So did Black Flag Resynced actually improve the original? In a lot of ways, yes, it did. It improved the world, the presentation, and most of the experience around the original game, but it did not improve every part of Black Flag. Some things have clearly been replaced with newer systems, whether those systems fit the original design or not, and that is why I don't think Resynced completely replaces the game from 2013. It is probably the version I would recommend to someone experiencing Edward's story for the first time, but the original still has value beyond nostalgia. It has faster combat, a more complete narrative structure, and content that the remake decided it no longer needed. Resynced understands exactly why people remember Black Flag. The sailing, the Caribbean, and the fantasy of becoming a pirate captain are all better than ever. I'm just not completely convinced it understands that the parts people remember most fondly were not the only parts that made the original special. So yes, Black Flag Resynced may be the better pirate game, but whether it is the definitive version of Black Flag depends on how much Black Flag you believe was worth preserving.